Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Dr. Andrew Polk, who's an associate professor at Middle Tennessee State University and author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty Magazine. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's the Assistant Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Mr. Andre Wong, who is the General Counsel for the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Guys, great to have you here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, one of the things that's going on in our world that we don't talk much about, and it's really the persecution of Christians that is taking place on a worldwide basis. In Nigeria, the Nigerian court announced that they are having a trial against a Christian mother for alleged blasphemy, and that is going to continue to be a battle that's going to continue to happen on an ongoing basis. We have a Christian mother here who remains in prison for allegedly sharing a blasphemous video on WhatsApp that condemned the lynching of an individual in Nigeria. We have a Nigerian student who was at university who was murdered and set on fire by a mob of her classmates for sharing her Christian faith. You know, so many of us in the United States think that, wow, this is something that happened someplace else. And it's clear that in 80% of the world, they don't get to serve their God the way they see fit. But the reality is just because it's happening in somebody else's backyard does not mean that one day it may be showing up in your backyard. You know, Bettina, you're somebody who had a chance to work on a worldwide basis for our church and has seen some issues as it relates to what's going on as it relates to Christian from a targeting standpoint on a worldwide basis. But when we take a look at this particular case, it seems like in a country like Nigeria, the idea of putting Christians on trial doesn't even seem to raise an eyebrow. It almost seems to be par for the course and just another day in the court system. You know, what are your thoughts on this? And have you seen some of this activity as well in other places around the world?
So, Orlin, this is such a tragic case, but unfortunately, it really isn't that unusual. But to really understand what is happening in Nigeria, you have to understand that this is a country about the same size as Texas, and it's divided into north and south. And in the north, you have predominantly Muslim population, and in the south, predominantly Christian. And in the northern states, there are at least 12 states where the Sharia penal code laws are in effect. And so these laws are administered through what they call Sharia courts, which sort of operate in this uneasy partnership with the secular civil courts. And so under Sharia code laws, a woman who has a child outside of marriage, I mean, that's sufficient evidence for adultery, and that carries a sentence, a potential sentence of death by stoning. Also under these laws are blasphemy laws, which is the case that you just mentioned. You know, I was talking just a few weeks back with an attorney who works in Nigeria, and he is currently appealing a blasphemy case conviction in northern Nigeria. And, you know, he said to me, you know, these are the laws that we're operating under, but even more frightening for those who are involved on the ground are the sort of the mob reprisals that often come along with these cases.
Wow.
So you have the legal culture, but then you also have a social culture where there is just simply not a tolerance for religious dissenters in any form. So that's the context in which we see this case particularly unfolding.
Unbelievable. Andre, when you hear this type of thing happening and being somebody who's fighting for religious freedom in your part of the United States, I mean, what do you think when you hear this and the possibility that we here, maybe even in the United States, should be really making our voices heard?
Yeah, you know, a recent study says that worldwide, 5,500 Christians or killed because of their faith. I would submit to you that that's probably a very, very gross understated figure. According to a report by Open Doors USA and World Relief, the number of persecuted Christians worldwide in 2020 was 360 million. And so this is any level of persecution, whether it's imprisonment to job retaliation. So the United States is unique. I mean, we have a system of due process where an accused has the right to legal representation, the right to confront accusers, the right to remain silent. But these totalitarian regimes that make up the rest of the world not only reject due process, but have no tolerance for religious pluralism, as Bettina mentioned, and they force doctrinal conformity. I will mention that in an upcoming issue of Liberty magazine, I tell the story of my grandfather, who was arrested, imprisoned, and executed during the Cultural Revolution in China because of his faith. And so this issue hits home. It's literally in my DNA.
Well, here's my takeaway from this, because for many people, Nigeria used to be the place where you got the emails promising you that if you just sent $5, they'd send you back 500. And but the reality of the situation is the dynamics and the structure of the country there are such that with impunity, we're watching this happen. And here's my takeaway from all of this. There are in this country right now, people clamoring for some of the elements of what we see in places like Nigeria. And I don't think they've connected the dots sufficiently to realize that once you start trading away democratic norms, you're not going to like what you get back in return. And, wanting to have a strong man, wanting to empower somebody to do what they want to do, regardless of what, the abiding document says. Nigeria is a glaring example of where we will end up as a country if we continue down the reckless path that many are on right now, because some are so caught up with outcomes that they forget process matters. And to gain the outcome that they desire, they are willing to shred and sacrifice process, forgetting that at the end of the day, the thing that makes this country what it is that we have in place things that guarantee that the process will go a certain way.
Andrew, what really stunned me, and when we talk about that 5,500 number that Andre alluded to, that same report tells us that nearly 90% of that 5,500 was basically convicted and prosecuted and persecuted in Nigeria. So even when you look at the numbers that are out there and realizing, and the irony is this is not a country that's quote unquote 90% Muslim. This is a country in which you have a very large Christian population there. And it seems as though is the one who quote unquote is in power, is calling the shots, or at least allowing a group to do whatever they feel like doing and not coming in and trying to slow it down in any way, And you've written on a number of these topics and things that you've seen. I mean, when you hear this, what does it cause you to think?
I think the biggest takeaway is that it gives us better perspective, right? As my wife has beautifully said, perspective is a jerk, right? I want to make my world the world, right? I want to pretend that I'm the center of it and everything matters. And I think when you see what's happening in Nigeria, the perspective is the number of times that I hear Christians in America talking about their persecution, where it seems as what they're talking about often is a loss of power. If I have lost power, it feels like persecution. Therefore, I'm persecuted because I read the Bible and Paul says, if you follow Jesus, you'll be persecuted. And yet, when we look at that, oftentimes these groups in America, sometimes what they want to do, the policies they propose, as Dr. Brown just said, seem to be the same type of persecution that they're accusing other people of doing. They want to codify that and socially make that some aspect of what the faith of Jesus Christ means, right, as we move in the world. Real Christians are being persecuted for their faith because they're Christians, beaten, killed. That matters. It should matter to all of us. And it also should occasionally at least give us pause when we accuse like Starbucks of persecuting us because they changed their Christmas cups. It's not persecution. You just don't like it. There's a difference, and it should matter.
You know, Bettina, one of the things that I wonder about, and you kind of mentioned it, that it's really kind of like a three-pronged act that takes place when these things happen. We're starting to even find out that in some countries that the idea of somebody being imprisoned for whatever their Christian or religious views may be, they're actually safer in prison than actually coming back out because of the quote unquote mob environment that comes looking for you when the results of what they may be looking for, you know, in quote unquote a court case, you know, doesn't go the direction they want. I mean, remember we had this young man in Pakistan who would find himself in jail, and there was some thought as to trying to get him out may actually create more harm for him than allow him to stay in. I mean, so that even complicates it even more.
And you're absolutely right, Orlan. And in that case, he was actually, the young man that you refer to in Pakistan, he was actually kept in a solitary cell for many years because of the danger to him, even from the other prison inmates. And I think it goes, you know, on a large scale, you know, this issue writ large, it boils down to what Andrew has just described, and that is a correct understanding of religious freedom and developing a culture in which dissent is not only tolerated, but we stand for other people's rights to dissent. You know, we don't want a monoculture when it comes to religious expression. And, you know, I think it serves as a grim warning sign for, as Dr. Brown said, what we are looking at ahead in the future of America, if we continue down this path of seeing religious freedom as a way to enforce a certain religious culture and not as a way to protect religious pluralism in our country. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of religious freedom that we really need to tackle.
You know, Andre, Dr. King talked about that it's not even so much the banter of my friends, but, you know, it's the silence of my friends, you know, by not saying something. And that seems to be somewhat of what many of us could be accused of. We see something like this and we say, well, that's somebody else's problem. But we have to, I believe, speak up at all times. I mean, what's your thoughts on those?
Yeah, and so my closing thought is on the political sphere. The big topic right now is immigration reform, and a lot of that discussion is going around border security. But the United States has an asylum process, a process for people seeking refuge from persecution based on religious grounds, persecution based on political beliefs. And the problem is that part of this immigration discussion needs to address how those asylum seekers and those applications are adjudicated, and the backlog that are before those officers and immigration judges. You know, many cases are frivolous, but many cases are credible, and so the system has become kind of a deterrent in itself, where the world is just looking to us and being deflated about what America stands for.
You know, it just still reminds us of the statement, injustice for one is still injustice for all, that we have to be willing to stand up and to be counted for something, even when it's not directly impacting us. You know, we have this case that's called Joseph Parish versus Nessel. And what we actually have is that St. Joseph is a Catholic parish located in St. John's, Michigan. And since 1924, this institution has operated a top-notch elementary school. However, they are obviously founded in conjunction with the St. Joseph Catholic Organization, and part of the Catholic organization is also putting out great schools. But St. Joseph kind of requires all of its staff to uphold Catholic teaching in word, in deed, and including any beliefs as it relates to gender, marriage, and sexuality. It follows all the Catholic teachings on issues like pronouns for staff and children and things of that nature. However, there's been a recent change to the law in Michigan that threatens to make it illegal for St. Joseph to ensure that its school rules and those who serve its parish community uphold its religious beliefs. You know, we're starting to see this, what I would call tension, that always takes place as it relates to wanting to be involved in your academics in conjunction with your religious beliefs. It's almost this juxtaposition of a business of academia, also with the religious tenor of being, quote unquote, a denomination of some sort, and you want all of your affiliates to operate together. We take a look at this particular court case and some of the struggles that seem to be coming with it. I'm just curious to hear, where would you end up on this and how would you begin the process? Andre, how do you begin this thought process when you try to figure out how can these two things peacefully coexist? And not just peacefully coexist across a nation with a whole bunch of different points of views and cultures and things of that nature. Is it even possible?
Right. Yeah. So the statute that we're talking about is fairly recent. It passed in March of last year, 2023, which codified in state law and expanded the civil rights law in the state of Michigan that prohibited discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, with no religious accommodations or ministerial exceptions, except for those that exist in federal law. And so, you have Michigan saying, okay, this is the way it's going to be for everybody. And so now, we now look at how is the court going to apply this? And, it's settled jurisprudence that the First Amendment protects the rights of religious groups, including churches and schools, to operate in accordance with their ministry and mission, free from government interference. The U.S. Supreme Court, the most recent case that they held on this is Our Lady of Guadalupe, holding that churches and religious institutions are free to make internal management decisions, including employment and curriculum policies, without government interference. So with this settled jurisprudence, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I'm confident in saying that the protection of religious institutions is a safe and settled part of this.
Right. And I agree with what Andre has said. If the First Amendment means anything at all, the First Amendment Free Exercise Clause, it means that religious institutions do have a right to define their identity and to organize themselves according to their religious convictions. I don't think anyone can argue with that fundamental premise. But I would add a twist here, because Orlin, you said, that there's increasing tensions between the ability of religious institutions to operate educational facilities. And I would argue that a cause of that increasing tension is when you add in the element of state funding. Because once a school accepts state funding, whether that's through a voucher program or through other indirect means, or even now there's an attempt to expand direct funding for religious education, once government funding enters that equation, temperature is going to go up. Yep. And I don't think that the First Amendment protects the ability of religious institutions to use government money to further its religious mission. And so there, I think, is where we're going to have to really, double down on making sure we are clear where religion starts and state influence and funding ends.
So here's the problem. The problem is that apparently some folks have not gotten the memo that if you want a real fight on your hands, try to impose a variant belief system on a religious entity. You will almost never see the kind of passion generated by religious enthusiasm any other place. And so to think that it somehow makes sense to even open up a discussion that says there is the possibility that we are going to force a religious entity to adopt and to abide a belief system that is woefully out of step with who it is and what it does that is a battle for the ages. This is why people have tried to wed and join at the hip racial issues with certain sexual issues. And I would argue they are very different and should not be joined at the hip. And so as a person of faith, I preach two things in my church. One of the things that I preach is strict adherence to the principles of the Bible. I don't think there's any room to play around there. But the other thing that I also preach is that the love of God demands that in our interaction with other people who believe differently than we do, we don't get to use the fact that we believe a certain way as a club and as a bat that we can now use to beat up the rest of the world. And I think those two things are what will keep us out of trouble. But to think that you're going to somehow wake up one day and think you're going to force a religious institution to embrace and to coddle up to something that they find diametrically opposed to who they are and what they're about, yeah, good luck with that one.
But you know, Andrew, this is my struggle here. We take a look and we see that the Michigan Civil Rights Commission and the Michigan legislature purposely and pointedly wanted to ensure that there would be no religious accommodations. I mean, this wasn't like it was an afterthought. We quote unquote just that slipped through the cracks, and that's something. They made it a point of reference to be crystal clear. We do not want to accommodate that under any circumstances, and that's how we're moving forward with this. I mean, the overtness of this is almost as frightening as just the fact that we're even having this conversation.
Yeah, to me, this gets very messy very quickly. I think what Bettina said is a helpful indicator here, that there is a difference between the state, right, political organization saying that you must do this, you must have this, or like Lawrence was saying, that you must believe this, you must adopt these principles. I think the First Amendment is very clear on that. But right, this makes me think of it's not apples to apples, but Green v. Connolly in 1971, in which there were a lot of white evangelical Protestants who said, we will not integrate our campuses. And essentially the federal government said, okay, but you can't take our money, right? Money is an indication here, right? We're not telling you that you have to do this. We're not telling you what to believe, how you interpret the Bible, what your theology is. We are saying that if you're taking our money, then non-discrimination has to be a cornerstone of what you do with that money. And it becomes increasingly problematic to me, as Lawrence just said, of the ways in which somehow religious freedom becomes a discussion of a religious right to discriminate. Theologically, I don't understand that, but also I think this is where we get into the muddy ground of everyone reacting to what they think the other person will do. Not what they've done, what they said, but I'm going to stop them from. And it gets out of control pretty quickly.
You know, Bettina, one of the struggles that I kind of have with this is you look at the political operation or the political mindset that moved forward with this, with a clear emphasis regarding what they wanted to have happen to religious organizations. You know, it's kind of like even our show itself, Faith and Politics. We've taken the two things that you're not supposed to talk about in polite company and jammed them together into one show. It almost seems like it's the same concept, that you got these two diametrically opposed points of view being told you got to live together. And it seems to me that unless they learn how to peacefully coexist, we're going to find, this tit for tat taking place on a state by state basis. And the idea that the federal government or the Supreme Court may actually make a decision that cuts across all boards. And as soon as they do, some state's going to figure out how to undermine it with some particular legislation. I mean, Does this ever get fixed, or are we just fooling ourselves here?
Right. And you're absolutely right, Orlin. And, I don't want to be misunderstood here, because I am fully behind the idea that religious institutions must have the ability to define their own beliefs and to organize themselves according to those beliefs. However, I would say that it is not the fault of the left entirely, and it is not the fault of the right entirely. It is a joint problem. And, you look at this case out of Maine in 2022, Carson v. Macon, where religious schools forced open the faucet of state funding to flow to religious schools. The Supreme Court said now when a secular program is funded for private education, religious schools must be also funded on the same basis. Now, the way in which that was done, I think, inflames this conversation, this whole conversation. And so you have the Attorney General in Maine reacting by passing legislation to say that only schools that abide by certain LGBTQ non-discrimination standards can participate in. So they're finding another way around, a backdoor, just like you said, Orland. And so this tit for tat goes on and on and on. At some point, we have to say, we're a religious organization. We don't want state funding. We're going to be viable on our own. And we want to enter into a meaningful dialogue for how we can make this country a more peaceful place for everyone to coexist.
And we can only hope that that's where we end up when it's all said and done, because we're a country in which religion and the rest of the world has to peacefully coexist in order for us to truly be the country that we all want it to be. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
Religious persecution in Nigeria typically results in at least 4,000 Christians being killed every year. But what you may not have known is that number, which is the floor, not the ceiling, more than doubles the number of deaths any other place in the world due to persecution of Christians. It's staggering.
Wow. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So I'm going to radically change the tone here. Sorry, Dr. Brown. Did you know, Orland, that the third largest movie industry in the world is in Nigeria? So we have Hollywood, Bollywood, and Nollywood.
Oh.
Wow. Whoa, didn't know that one. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that 2 Supreme Court justices have appeared on U.S. currency? Chief Justice John Marshall on the $500 bill and Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase on the $10,000 bill.
Wow, 2 pieces of currency.
Neither of them are in circulation today.
Never owned those. Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Oh, the least consequential thing that you will learn today is that even though I grew up in rural Mississippi, I was shocked to recently know that there are 9 states of the union that contain more cows than human beings. I don't know what it means or why it matters, but it's still weird to me.
Well, thank you for that one. Guys, it was great being with you today and really enjoyed our conversation and our dialogue. Looking forward to doing it again. And thank you for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith in politics. See you next time.